Okay. Have I started a live video? Live, okay. I have. Sorry, y'all. I've had some technical difficulties. Alright. I'm just going to wait for Munroe to join. Super excited. So let me check it out. Go live with... Just going to wait for Munroe to join. Here she is.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey. How are you doing?
Hey, you've changed your hair.
Oh, I'm always changing my hair.
It
Always.
looks so good.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's a lot.
I'm good in my soul, but like obviously everything's a bit of a mess. Understatement. It's testing, but I've got hope, you know. I think there's two ways of looking at it. Like the world is fucked, but I feel like we're becoming closer as a community because of it. And I feel like we're becoming much more organized and, sorry, I've got animals running around everywhere. We're becoming much more organized and conscious of each other's experiences. So I'm choosing to focus on that rather than how bad things are, because I feel like I might lose my mind otherwise.
You know, it's an interesting thing. I was thinking about this, well, I've been thinking about this, especially with the current civil rights movement that's happening, the largest that we've experienced and certainly may experience in our lifetime, and how a global pandemic might have laid the groundwork for it in
Oh my
a
God,
way
definitely.
that you think as well?
I think so, yeah. I think that COVID-19's definitely exposed a bunch of things that we knew were a thing, but there wasn't necessarily the data to tell everybody who doesn't experience it what's going on. You know, we knew that there was discrepancies with race and gender identity, and that Black people were experiencing a narrative that is not what white people experience. So to have that now, that, you know, that concrete proof that when it comes down to the crunch of a global pandemic, Black people are the first people to be affected, that speaks volumes. And it's not just that, it's like geographical racism, it's legacy of slavery, and all of these things that feed into systems like healthcare, especially healthcare during this time, and how Black people navigate that system. So yeah, I think that it's like it's lifted the veil off of society, and we can actually see society for what it is. And we're living in a system.
Agreed. I mean, I think as well, what I've found interesting is because of the ability for people to reflect, to actually pull back, and all of the distractions that disappeared. You can't shop, you can't go out and see friends, you can't go to bars, it's like you can't actively ignore things that are going on within the society. So the messages are getting through more clearly. It's as if they're more piercing, because a lot of what I'm finding as well is that people are saying, oh, I never knew this was happening. This is something that I was just completely unaware of, which is shocking, but I guess I understand it.
But I feel like because we're all experiencing coronavirus, so it's like we've got that commonality that we never had before. So we're all experiencing the exact same thing, but also in very different ways. So I think when people are confronted with that, they're like, well, why are we experiencing it in different ways? I didn't think that racism existed. And now it's a definite reason for why we're experiencing life in a different way. So yeah, I do think also spending much more time with our phones, we're much more engaged in what's actually happening with the world because there's less distractions. I think that we're all becoming a lot more politically minded because we've seen how conservative governments have failed us when it comes to their response to the virus, and how largely So I'm going to shut the door so that they go out. So,
I'm the same. I've got a zoo here. I've got my dog and my two cats running around. And it's chaos.
I've got two puppies and a cat. So
I've been following them.
I think, you know, when I've lost my train of thought, but ultimately we've got the data now, and I feel like it's undeniable. And the governments have failed us, and we need to hold them accountable. And I think also we're becoming a lot more rallied. We're figuring out the game plan of how to change things and who to put the pressure on, and being a lot more assertive with our time, because we've got the time.
Well, so let's jump into some specific topics that have caught my interest, and certainly I'd like to know more about. I mean, I think first I'm just going to lay some history, which is we met through Angelica Ross at dinner in London, which seems like a million light years away now.
A different time,
kind of shoulder to shoulder with people, and it was a dinner in which it was a real awakening for me. I think, you know, we were all talking about race, and I'm more of a contrarian or questioner. I'm very curious, and we were having conversations that lights were going off for me that I had never thought about before. And at the time we were talking about accountability within the media as well, and how the narrative needs to shift. And I guess, well, the first thing that I'll ask is, so how do you find that things are significantly different from what's happening here in the US? I mean, is the movement different in its narrative or in its needs?
It's different because the systems that we're protesting against are set up in a different way. So the police are very different in the UK than they are in America, insofar as not everyday police have guns, so there's not a problem with guns as there is in America. They aren't funded in the way that they're funded in America. I feel like they're publicly funded here. And there's corruption, but it's different. It's much more insidious here than you know, putting people in chokeholds in public and things like that. We've still got a problem with black people dying in police custody. But it's very, racism here in general is very different than it is in America. People like to pretend here that we don't have a problem with racism, that it doesn't exist, which is why it's been such a gag to be like, well, we've been telling you this whole time, and a lot of people are acting shocked. But I feel like because Black British people are such a minority here, we're 3% of the UK population. So we're such a small percentage. And then when you've got transness on top of that, it's it's minute. So we're up against a lot here, and a lot of denial. I feel like people are waking up in a different way than they are in America. I feel like we've had enough in America, and I feel like here it's like we need change, but also a lot of people realizing things that they'd never even thought of before. And I think a lot of people are much more shocked.
I think because in Australia, not that Australia is the UK, I mean, racism has a different flavor in Australia. And I would agree that it's far more insidious because you come across a person of color far less. It's just that you don't see a society that reflects diversity. And so you don't actually have to actively think about racism either. I mean, you could go a whole year and not think about racism. Racism was something that happens on the news in America or in a film about slavery. So there's kind of that shift. And I think even in the UK, there's racism directed towards people of color in very different ways, as in every different race has their own vitriol coming from the white majority that seems very, like in America, I think the Black community suffers it in a way that I've not experienced in Australia or the UK. So I understand what you mean by it's kind of more insidious. It's more maybe in policy.
I think we need to look at the histories of the countries, and like the history of Australia is very unique insofar as it, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not Australian, so I only know what I've been told and what I've researched, but it's a British colony, isn't it?
It is, yeah, we're part of the Commonwealth.
Part of the Commonwealth, and wasn't it formed with emptying the British jails, and then British prisoners were sent to Australia, and then the indigenous people, as a result, usually what happens with colonialism is the indigenous people are effectively wiped out or marginalized and pushed to the fringes. And so obviously the racism in Australia is going to be very, very different. And then obviously what happened to the indigenous people was awful, with, you know, theft of children and babies and things like that. So that's not what happened in America, but it's still racism. So I think every single country, and then obviously with imperialism in the UK and colonialism and the royal family and all of this kind of stuff, it's all linked. But I think people just need to be aware of what's happened in the country, and like what's happened for white people to become the majority in a country which isn't their native homeland, and how that power has been consolidated. So in obviously America, with the native people being pushed to the fringes, like that was the birth of racism. And then in the UK, I think the birth of racism largely came with colonialism, and then people of color, Black people, being brought in to rebuild the economy with the NHS as well. So it's very, very intricate. But I think the issue is that what we face in all Western societies is that history isn't taught accurately or truthfully. It's very much like we just don't address the elephant in the room. We don't talk about what it's very much from a white perspective, isn't it? It's like
well, you learn about apartheid. That's how it goes down. I think on that, you know, what I find curious is and really riveting at the moment is that the narrative view is shifting, and we're looking at history maybe not so much as a set of written texts that we all study, but a story that has been told. And, you know, obviously there are certain parts of the story that have been focused on. And so when we are going back at the moment, what this movement around the world, I think, is allowing people to reevaluate is that there is a different lens through history as well, which has not had the voice that it has needed. Yeah. And so people, especially activists like yourself today, are showing that there is actually a different narrative. There are different experiences, and these stories are just as important because they impact on people who are living now and generations to come.
Absolutely. And you start to realize how much of history has been erased and not told truthfully. Like the narrative that Christopher Columbus discovered America, and that's dangerous because it pushes the idea that things aren't real until they're discovered by white people. So I want people to just really think about what the world would be like if whiteness wasn't the set norm or the goal to aspire to. What would the world look like without, you know, white people having historically invaded Africa? Like, what would Africa look like? White supremacy has affected the world, and it's not that we want people to feel bad about it because we can't change it, but we want people to acknowledge it, and we want people to realize and have some empathy that a lot of Black people don't even know their last names, their real last names, and they've got slave owner names, slave owner surnames. So it's impacted on people of color in a way that I don't think white people ever really fathom. And I think that people are now starting to wake up to that.
That's a really interesting point. It's something that I've been noticing. I mean, I think I've been to 12 rallies now. just here in Los Angeles, and there's a bunch of intricacies I want to go into and ask what's happening in the UK. But first, when you say that we're reflecting back on history, and there is this kind of fear or white pushback about what's going to happen if we start to invest in that narrative, I think that a lot of very afraid white people, as soon as we begin talking about whiteness, think, well, so what's the end result here? We're just going to hand everything over. That's what's going to happen. The new culture is just going to become black culture. That's what we're trying to do. And you see the emotions taking over, the very kind of Piers Morgan way of, hammering at something and saying, well, I'm not the person who does this, and I'm not the person who does that. And I think it's such an aggressive pushback when nobody is saying, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back into the history books, and we're going to rewrite all of history, and then we're going to say, your house is going to be my house, this land is going to be my land, and this is going to be this. And I think somewhere the fear is getting involved in the equation, and people aren't seeing that just acknowledging the history of racism does not mean that the entire world is going to change overnight, that you are going to lose everything, that all of the new norms are going to become black culture. But maybe, it's...
Well, that's the T, isn't it? It's like, Jane Elliott. Do you know Jane Elliott? She's an amazing white race activist. And she's phenomenal because anti-racism sounds different coming from white people than it does from black people. It's almost like, how dare you speak up against racism? And then a white person will say, it's like, oh, actually, some really interesting facts. So Jane Elliott's amazing at using that privilege to highlight white people's behaviors and attitudes towards racism. And she's got this exercise where she's like, white people, if you are happy being treated how black people are treated in this country, please stand. And nobody stands. So it's interesting what you said about the aggressive response, because a lot of all white people know that black people are treated differently, but they're not willing to have that for themselves. So it's almost like, why are they so happy for black people to be experiencing all of these things? Because they know that it's a thing. Because if they didn't think it was a thing, then they wouldn't have such an aggressive pushback. But I think, obviously, the people that don't have the aggressive pushback are the people that understand that equality doesn't mean that you lose anything. It just means equality. But I think that a lot of white people are scared of experiencing the things that people of color have experienced. And we need to get over that hurdle of, people just pushing back out of fear. And that's exactly what it is, though, isn't it? Because like politics weaponizes the fear of these people of, going through what we've been through. So I think we just need to push empathy. We just need people to understand that all experiences are valid, but you need to embrace that. You can't push against it.
Well, I think on both sides, I'm really watching what's happening politically at the moment, and especially with the media and the swings in the media. And it seems that, of course, the most extreme voices on either side of the political spectrum are what is going to be heard. And that it seems as if there is a lack of nuance in the conversation. It's either black or it's white. It's either rioting or it's law and order. There's no nuance in the conversation. There's no, well, let's have some empathy. Let's discuss this. Let's think about this. It's people read the statistics in one way that helps their story, or they read the statistics in another way that helps the other story. And there's this kind of to and fro. So on that topic, how do you feel, you have been a trailblazer yourself, and certainly a lightning rod. I mean, I've watched so many interviews with you now where they're hard to watch, and you sit there with, such dignity, and you take all of this shit that people are throwing at you, and you respond eloquently, and you stick to the points, and it's just these people, and they seem so mad going at you. And of course, hitting on racial epithets and trans epithets. Well, you know, so what are we saying? That every little kid should become the opposite sex now? Is that what we're saying? And it's like,
Yeah.
when the nuance goes out of the conversation and a whole part of the population wakes up and says, well, I don't want that. I don't want my child on hormone therapy at 4 years of age. And
Yeah.
it's all of a sudden the nuance is lost. So how do we get that back into this conversation?
It's really like, the reason why I don't get upset when I'm in those situations is because it's such a power knowing that you're informed and that you're right, and also understanding why other people get upset. I know that there's a huge problem with racism within the white British working class because of how they've been manipulated by the upper classes and used as the worker bees to essentially disseminate racism to allow capitalism to work. So it's like those nuances of, you know, again, having empathy with the, like, I know that the white British working class have been through the ringer when it comes to policy. We had a prime minister called Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and she was pretty much the devil. But she was an elitist, and she marginalized the working class to the point where they felt, when you say white privilege to a member of the British white working class, it's like, well, what white privilege? And it's just trying to get them to understand, well, imagine if you were also black and working class and British on top of everything that you already have to deal with. So I guess it's almost like managing people, and it's not fair because, you know, we shouldn't have to, as marginalized people, manage the people that are oppressing us. But it really is like that for those of us that are doing the work and that are out there in the public domain. You need to exercise patience and understanding. And it's not always from a constructive place, and it's really sometimes difficult to empathize with somebody that is actively discriminating against you, saying that you shouldn't have access to healthcare, you shouldn't have access to services. So I guess it's, you know, knowing when to exercise certain pockets of energy. It's a real minefield out there in the media, because ultimately the media is responsible for a lot of this racism, because it's how people stay informed. So if people aren't being informed with the right information, or if they're reading a publication with a certain agenda, then they're going to take that on themselves. And ultimately, the racist narratives in the media are the perspectives of the elite. They're not the perspectives of the working class. It's very much like people are being told what to think. So I think once you encourage free thinking and inquisitive minds, then that's how we get there.
I mean, this is my favorite topic, free speech. And I think it's the right time to talk about the next topic. So I agree with free thinking. And I think that unfortunately what's happening in the current environment is that free thought is really being repressed on both sides. And what I mean by that is we have, of course, a media narrative that for so long has been oppressing Black voices and Black narratives. And now we have an almost opposite swing back happening online with cancel culture. And you've experienced extremes of both. I mean, first of all, congratulations on your appointment with L'Oreal Paris.
Thank you.
I mean, it's extraordinary. And
never thought that would be a thing, by the way.
I mean, I think, you know, in the UK, we were kind of talking about it, obviously, before everything has happened now. And so I want to approach it with some sensitivity. But you said something really beautiful in your post after you had spoken to L'Oreal Paris, which was you believe in accountability over cancel culture.
Absolutely.
And so with L'Oreal Paris, I mean, it's the same. Well, how about in your words, what has happened?
It's a long story, all the way back 3 years ago.
No, I mean now for you. So
okay. Well, basically, last week they posted a graphic saying that it's always worth it to speak out, or speaking out is always worth it. And I just thought, wait a minute, I was sacked for speaking about systemic racism effectively. I wasn't, you know, very nice about it, you know, not, I wasn't nasty, but I wasn't, you know, very, I didn't mind my P's and Q's. I was very emotional.
Do you mind if I interrupt you for 2 moments there? I've gone back and I've read the posts and I've watched all of the subsequent interviews when you were dropped from L'Oreal. What I find almost hysterical, it's almost a comedy, is that everything that you said is what is now the current accepted narrative, and nothing that you said was controversial at all. So
well, I mean, it was controversial 3 years ago because we weren't having these conversations in the media. Right. It was a very much internal conversation surrounding racism and how all white people, whether you're conscious of it or not, we're born into a white supremacist system. Mm-hmm. The reason why our countries are wealthy is because of black people enslaved. So, or white people, black people being exploited. So it was very much like, I was just angry. I posted after the Charlottesville riots where all of those white men were marching, Nazis were marching with tiki torches and then driving a car into a crowd and killing of anti-racism protester. So I was pissed off. And then I posted about this and all hell broke loose. I lost my job. They also said that privately, they did.
You posted about this privately on your Facebook. It wasn't even.
I posted about it 2 months before my campaign came out. So there, you know what? It was emotional, and I stand by every word that I said. But then they posted a graphic. This is 3 years in the future. And then I was like, wait a minute, I lost my job for speaking about this. This, you know, you can't just skip forward without making right what has happened. And then everybody got behind me and held them to account. And then I spoke to the president and she was like, you know what, I completely agree with you. I want to find a way that we can work together and we can, you know, I can have your insight, you can have our backing. And it just, you know, I just thought, I don't want to be mad at somebody that's trying to do better. You know, if someone comes to me and says, will you help us be better as a company? This is what I advocate for all the time. So I'm not going to turn around and say, no, like you treated me badly. And although it was really painful for me at that point, the team that's there now is not the team that was there when I was there. So I'm just looking at it in a way of progress rather than shooting from a place of ego. Because if it was a place of ego, then I'd be like, I don't need you. I don't want anything to do with you. But I genuinely want the beauty industry to be better. And I want a representative for my communities. Like how many Black transgender women are sat at the table in these conversations? There's hardly ever any.
And I think it's an extraordinary moment of accountability and of corporate accountability. You had moments during this civil rights moment that's going on where one of the, no worries. One of the things that has happened is, of course, a lot of organizations are coming out and they're posting a tile and they're saying Black Lives Matter and they're saying we stand with the current moment, and it's kind of being co-opted. And then of course L'Oreal had Speaking Up, It's Worth It, and now very publicly they've been held accountable and have stepped up to the plate. So when you wrote that post and now that you're appointed at L'Oreal, it feels like a huge win, and it also feels like a huge moment of growth for the company. And it's made me think about accountability and corporate accountability because it also applies to the individual, to the family, to the society, and to the culture. And I think one of my questions is, so what's happening at the moment I'm seeing a lot of, for example, is somebody digs up a tweet that somebody posted 8 years ago, and they're disgusting, homophobic, bigoted, racist, transphobe. And then you have these, I mean, I'm not on Twitter, but there's this whole such and such is over party or cancel this person.
Oh my God, someone's cancelled every day, aren't they?
Oh my God. I just
it's anxiety inducing.
and it's also the most banal, tribal,
Yes,
basic form of
it's like putting
communication.
someone. It's like putting someone in the stocks. It's like mass humiliation. It's like it's pretty much a public hanging, except the person still just lives with the that hanging over their head for the rest of their lives.
And everyone who
And
hangs them gets to be anonymous.
yeah,
They get to spew vitriol from a keyboard. And
exactly.
my concern there is that what happens is that it actually, I don't think that people understand that that stifles free speech, because if there is somebody who is genuinely a racist,
Hmm.
who is genuinely inflicting harm, and who has malicious motives, we
Hmm.
want to hear them, because we want to be able to point to them and say, I have my eye on this person. And I fear that what's happening is, and this is what I'm curious to hear from you on, are we in a little bit of a liberal bubble at the moment? Are we seeing change on our Instagram? Are we seeing change on our Facebook and our Twitters? And does that reflect the change that's happening in the society? Or are we in an echo chamber where people cancel people and people become more afraid and they pull back, and then they go to the polls at poll time and they say, here's for Trump?
It's hard to say, isn't it, really? Because I feel like liberal people are much more vocal than conservatives. I feel
Yeah.
like your liberals are much more likely to say, I vote liberal, than someone walk into their workplace and say, I voted for Trump, you know? So
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult to say. I mean, approval ratings aren't good for Trump right now, and they're not good for Boris Johnson either. So I think this time does feel different, I think, because it is different. I feel like even if we are failing in the polls when it comes to like systems and policy change, such as like police reform, I feel like the protests are definitely holding the right people accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the sorry, these two. Even if we still end up with conservative leadership, I think that we're now holding that leadership to a different account than we were before. So I do feel like progress is being made. I feel like this movement feels like it's breaking out of the echo chamber because it's coming offline. It's not just, us talking amongst ourselves. We're actually going out and taking to the streets like the Women's March did. It feels very much like a Me Too movement, a Time's Up moment, insofar as, people actually being held to account. People
So
like,
what does that mean for you, to be held to account? And in terms of, so say for example, L'Oreal Paris is held to account and they
yeah.
actually make amends in a way that is active. It's not, I'm sorry, here's my public apology, now let's all move on. It's, this is what we're doing, this is who we're donating to. We want to make progress. We understand the mistakes that we've made. We're inviting Munroe Bergdorf into the company, and we want to see change happen. So
Yeah.
how do we hold somebody accountable and at the same time allow them the opportunity to grow?
It's it's making sure that it's not all lip service. It's like the NFL saying that we support Black Lives Matter, but they still haven't hired back Colin Kaepernick. It's not being afraid to do the controversial thing, and the controversial thing, unfortunately, is standing up for Black lives. And when you stand up for Black lives, it's it can't just be in speech. It needs to be in the form of donations, offering your assets, offering your resources, making sure that you don't have a problem with racism within your companies or places of work, putting in the right infrastructure to counter toxic environments. Like when we were speaking about holding people accountable in with the Me Too movement, there was a whole wave. Have you watched the American show, or the one with Reese Witherspoon and Jennifer Aniston?
Oh, the morning show.
That's it, the morning show. That detailed it perfectly. because it was all about, you know, companies having inequality audits and to see whether or not they actually had a proper, an actual problem, but also like acknowledging people's complicity. So I think that there's so many conversations within the accountability conversation, but it really is in action. It can't just be in speech or promises. It needs to be in actual action. And the problem with the government in the UK is that whenever there's an issue with race or gender inequality, they do a report, but the report's never actioned. So it's almost like they acknowledge that there's a problem, but they don't offer any solutions to the problem. And I think that that's ultimately really is because in doing that, they would have to acknowledge that these problems happened underneath conservative leadership. So I think really it's down to the people. This revolution has to be about the people. It has to be about what we can do, because we can't make the Conservatives or Republicans act in a certain way. It has to be about holding people accountable and demanding action.
And so when you see, for example, somebody's tweets are pulled up from 8 years ago, and they've used the N-word in relation to a song, let's say, and what we're seeing now is a wave of change. I mean, I even feel I look back at my history growing up in Australia, and I think about the culture at the time, and I feel that, I mean, there must have been times where I said something that would be considered part of the cancel culture wave. Now, certainly not maliciously, but as a young person without the internet. You know, I was one of those people that sat around and listened to the internet dial up, crazily enough. But I come from a small country town, so it's taken many years for me and lots of travel to shed and to be able to rid myself of certain unconscious bias, and at the same time still be able to acknowledge that bias exists, that bias comes up, and that I can now see that bias and choose whether or not to act on that bias and act opposite to what the bias is telling me. I feel that it's much harder for young people these days to recover later on from something that they may have done or said. But at the same time, there's this system whereby we're now actually progressing in terms of the language. So we understand the hurt that certain words cause in a far more active way than we ever have before. How is it for you in the UK? How is the language shifting or altering or changing around race? And the cancellation of what might have once been deemed, you know, terribly racist. Yeah,
I think the conversation is shifting in terms of, again, accountability. And when we go back and revisit certain things that are racially insensitive now, I think it's all about the apology. It's all about the acknowledgement that something wrong was done. And if someone doubles down and says, well, no, actually, I think I'm well within my rights to say that, and it's all about the art, I don't think that we should be practicing sensitivity when it comes to comedy or that kind of thing, you know, it's reducing our comedy. I think that's when alarm bells start going off, because you've had a community come to you and say that your behavior is, I sound like a teacher, that says like your actions aren't acceptable and they're hurtful. And I think that is, again, testament to who that person is who are they after being confronted and confronted with the results of their own actions? Do they double down, or do they apologize? And do they acknowledge why they need to apologize? I think it's all about the apology or the acknowledgement. And I think in the UK, it's getting better. I think that finally we're having certain conversations with things like blackface and how that was used in 2000s comedy. and we've had this conversation with you know, homophobia in comedy and why that's not funny, and if the comedian acknowledges that, you know, it was just a product of their surroundings and that they no longer hold those views, then I'm more inclined to give them another chance, because I think it's all about growth. Who I was when I was in high school is not who I am now. I think especially as trans people, we understand that, you know, we grow and we change and we become ourselves. We're not born with a perfectly in line set of politics. You know, it takes a certain amount of time to understand what's going on with the world. So I try to just exercise empathy, because I've had my old tweets brought up as well, and taken out of context largely. And you don't know what's going on with that person when they're tweeting that. So I try to understand, but also listen for the apology.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to switch some. Let's see here.
Hello.
Am I back?
Yes.
Okay. I was seeing that there was problems with the Wi-Fi, so I just switched to using the cell phone. We'll see if that's much better. I wanted to ask, and I'd be remiss not to, two major things. So first of all, is the goal to one day live in a colorblind society? Is that, and what would that mean for you? And how would that function? And what I mean by that, certainly, let me clarify, is that the color of your skin is as interesting as the TV show you watched last night, or the color of your hair. That it's, you know, it's as important as the type of breakfast you have in the morning. So a colorblind society in which, of course, you know, it's you can't not see a person's color, but there's no associations with it in the same way that they are today. Is that the goal?
I don't think that's the goal, no, because I think that we need to take into account history, and we can't, and ancestry. And I think that we should all be proud of where we're from. We should be proud of, you know, what we've been through as people, white, black, Asian, South Asian, East Asian, Indigenous, Native. We should all be proud of our differences. And I think the goal really is to celebrate difference. I don't think it's to ignore it or to eradicate it or to pretend that we're not different. I think that the goal really is to understand each other's cultures, understand each other's histories, and be empathetic towards what each other's been through, because we've all been through something, regardless of what race we are. So I want to live in a world where I'm more informed about difference. I understand the history and the experiences of different people. And so I can be an ally to them, because I don't think that anytime soon we're going to live in a world without any form of oppression. I feel like, unfortunately, human nature has shown throughout history that someone always gets the raw end of the deal. So I think it's about encouraging the celebration of difference rather than just ignoring it, because I think if we ignore it or become colorblind, then we become complacent, because there's always going to be issues.
Mm-hmm. And how, I mean, it's so sad, but there's, hopefully with what happened with the Supreme Court yesterday here in the States, there's some change coming. How are trans relations in the UK at the moment? How are you feeling about everything that's going on? I know there have been multiple murders in the past 2 weeks that seem to get no media coverage.
Yeah.
And recently we just had Trump revoke healthcare protections for trans people here in the States. And then yesterday we had a landslide decision whereby the Supreme Court will be upholding. Yeah, isn't it great?
Yeah, it's so good.
Oh my gosh.
And that was a trans woman that put that in. It was Amy Stevens, who is she's passed away now, so she unfortunately didn't get to see that. But it was a trans woman that was discriminated against in her workplace, and that was her lawsuit. So again, a trans woman changing queer history.
I just don't. I'll say this before I throw it over. I just don't understand what the push. I truly find it very difficult to understand why it is that we have issues with trans rights. I don't understand why people are so afraid of trans people. I can't wrap my head around it.
The issue is attached to religion, unfortunately, and faith is not the problem. Faith, there's good people that have faith, but organized, institutionalized religion pushes the narrative of a man and a woman. In every single religious text of monotheistic religion, it speaks about man and woman. And of course, we know that there's intersex people, there's trans people, there's non-binary people. People don't necessarily identify with the gender that's associated with their genitals. That's just not, a thing. And then science is brought into it and used as a way to justify this. But there's no scientific proof for religion. So we understand that people can have faith and there not be a scientific reasoning for it. But when it comes to gender identity and gender expression, it's, an affront to society. So I think the problem is that religion and organized religion has been so intertwined into society that a lot of people don't know any different. And it's like the foundation of society. And then we look at American history and British history, actually, in how queer people, especially gay people and lesbians, were discriminated against, in saying that it was an affront to society because the traditional family of man, woman, and children is the basis of society, of it functioning properly. Mm-hmm. So the idea of man and a woman has always been used as a way to oppress minorities. Even with Black people as well, with segregation laws, the idea was that Black people, especially Black women, couldn't use the women's toilets because there was an idea within white supremacy that Black people were inherently violent and posed a risk to white women. So white women used segregation laws to prioritize their safety over the safety of Black women. And I posted yesterday that these are segregation laws of what we're experiencing in the UK. So you guys had a win yesterday with Amy Stevens' case. We had a blow because Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, announced that this has been a long running thing, by the way, with a branch of feminism that doesn't like trans people, called gender critical feminism or trans exclusion or radical feminism. And they've been campaigning for 4 years against the trans community, saying that trans women pose a threat to safety to cisgender women and should be forced to use the male bathrooms, without recognizing that we are being murdered and we're being sexually abused, harassed, condemned on every level. And there's no statistics to show that trans people pose any threat to anybody, but it's still being used as a narrative to disseminate fear and for governments to show that they're in control and that they prioritize women. But, I almost wouldn't mind if they provided a solution and said, well, you can't use the women's toilet, but we're going to be building gender neutral toilets. But that's not the case. They're just saying, well, we don't care where you go, but you can't come in here. And that is segregation.
It seems like the battle lines have been drawn. I think what's happening, what I've been noticing that's happening is that and it's something that I fear is happening at the moment here Okay, what's happening with my phone? I fear it's something that's happening here with Black Lives Matter, and you know, I go out. So, for example, I'm out in the streets and we're marching, and there's the organized march, and then somebody takes a mic somewhere in the crowd, and they're you know, George Floyd, say his name, and there's this kind of great spirit and energy of what we're supporting. And then all of a sudden they're reading a quote from Karl Marx, and saying, you know, this is the society of the oppressed, and et cetera, and we need a whole revolutionary way of thinking. It's why we need socialism, or somebody says it's why we need communism. It's why we need, and I think, okay, we are not here so that you can smuggle in an idea of a government system that has nothing to do with the current issue at hand.
Yeah.
And it's being, so it's co-opted, and 90% of the time it's a white person with the microphone. So all of a sudden what we're fighting for is the voice of the Black community here in the States, and all of a sudden somebody is pushing or sneaking in communism or socialism or a different form of government, or an agenda that they have. And I think it's the same with trans rights. What I've found alarming is that both the right and the left are hijacking the issue of trans rights in order to seem either so incredibly woke that there's a virtue signal, or in order to send out the dog whistle on the right to all of their supporters that, like, they're coming for your bathrooms. You know, first it's the bathrooms, then it's your sons and daughters. And I always think, you know, a very famous person recently posted a very transphobic post and then essay, and I read the whole essay, and I thought, okay, I can understand where your thinking is kind of trying to go with feminism and with the inclusion of women, but then this thing is smuggled in about bathrooms, and I think it's always the indicator, because just on a basic level, Munroe, all I ever think is, if somebody's going to rape you in a bathroom, trust me, they're not reading the sign before they consider it. Like, it's not like they're looking, they're saying,
it's crazy
that
they're saying that, like, a man is going to go to the trouble of transitioning so that they can go and rape people. And I was like, do you realize how hard this shit is? Like, do you realize how difficult it is to exist in a society that doesn't have room for you? Like, do you honestly think that a rapist is going to become a woman and not be a woman so that they can go and actively cause harm? And that is an extremely violent thing to suggest, that trans people, especially trans women, are by nature abusers. I can't get over it.
It's a way of making sure that people make the association that that it's the same with the kind of pedophile gay narrative, or you know, the rapist trans narrative. I think you hit it right on the head, which is, so people are going to go through the excruciating process of transitioning so that they can get away with getting into the female bathroom. And I always, you know, it's always the most, it's just like, this is the dystopia. This is the propaganda that we're pushing now.
Yeah.
So what do you think, I'm just conscious of your time, so I'll ask you one more question. What do you think, or what do you hope happens moving forward? Where should the focus be? What do you find most important? And what should we be focusing on in order to be allies?
So immediately in America, if you haven't registered to vote, vote, because Trump's got to go. He's impacting the entire world. It's not just America. There's, you know, he's a beacon for racism. He's not the actual source of it, but he is acting as a catalyst and as a way of people co-signing and validating their bigoted views. So he's got to go. That's the first port of call in America, is register to vote and vote. In the UK, people just need to make sure that they're aware of what's going on with regards to policy and lawmaking, and the narratives that the politicians are using, notably the Conservative politicians. What is a distraction, and what's a distraction, and what is an excuse for them not fulfilling what they should be fulfilling. So do you know about the Grenfell fire in the UK? It was a massive tower block that went up in flames, and it was a huge oversight from the Conservative government, who knew that there was a chance that this building could go up in flames because of the cladding on it. But because it was such, it housed poor people, the working class, so they didn't do anything about it. And then hundreds of people burned alive inside this building, and it was a huge oversight. And they're still homeless. 60,000 people are still homeless. No, sorry, I don't know how many people it is, don't quote me on that, but it was a lot of people that are still homeless, and they haven't provided a report. There's all of these shortcomings that the government are delaying. There was also the Windrush scandal of people who came over to the UK after the war to rebuild the rebuild the NHS, and then they're now being sent back to their home countries after 50 years in the UK. So that's a massive scandal. And they revealed during the coronavirus that there was racism at play. But because they released it during the coronavirus pandemic, it flew way below the radar. So now the Conservative government are using certain things like law and order and protesting against trans rights as a way to seem like they're in control. So I think it's really just being aware about what's going on in your own country, being engaged, following the right people on social media. If your news feed is going back to normal right now, then you're not following the right people. Make sure that you stay engaged, because this can't be a moment. It needs to be a movement. Yeah, I think just keep digging. Don't just consume the media that you're immediately given. Dig and consume a wide array of media. Look at how different stories are reported in different places. There's an endless amount of things that you could be doing. But I think ultimately it comes down to questioning, asking yourself, what am I doing, and am I doing enough?
That's brilliant. And I think the only thing I would want to add to that is for everybody to have the conversations and have them openly, and be unafraid to make mistakes, and to grow. And I fear, again, you know, I'm talking to a lot of older people who are having a real difficult time understanding what's going on. And I would just say, dig deep into that and have the hard conversations.
Absolutely.
They're
Absolutely.
worth it.
And I think, you know, just, as you said, don't be afraid to get things wrong, but also don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong. You know, I think so many people are afraid of, you know, putting their foot in it, so they don't do anything. And I think, if you educate yourself, then there's less chance that you're going to get things wrong. So I think it's a combination of speaking up, but educating yourself before you speak up, so that you can have a conversation with somebody, not a debate. Because Black Lives Matter is not a debate, it's a conversation, and it needs to remain a conversation. That can never be a debate. Just like trans rights should not be a debate, even though it is. It's, I think it's all about having a conversation and bringing your perspective to the table, but understanding when it's time to just
button up. I couldn't have put it more beautifully myself.
Yeah.
You are an absolute heroine. I love you. I think that you're extraordinary. I'm
I feel the same about you.
Oh,
it was
thanks.
such a gag when I met you. I was like, oh, I respect you so much. I respect your art. I respect what you do, in respect to who you are and how you put that across to everybody. So thank you for being a one-off, because you're definitely a one-off.
Oh, well, the pleasure is mine, and thank you for joining me today, Munroe.
Anytime, my darling.
We'll talk soon.
Take care, darling. Bye.
Bye, beautiful.
How do I get out of this?
Okay, everybody. That was